In the previous video, we talked a bit about masteries. This was one of just 2 core systems introduced in Heart of Thorns that sought to tackle the question of endgame progression in an MMO without a level cap, which was a system I felt definitely didn't live up to its potential. On the other hand, however, I think in most respects, Elite Specialisations have been the single greatest feature added with Heart of Thorns. In fact, I think Elite Specialisations are so good, they're almost expansion sellers on their own. So let's talk about them. With HOT, ArenaNet added a whole new profession to the game, the Revenant, who is the missing heavy, medium vitality character. However, from this point I really don't see much space for them to continue adding new classes. So how do we get new skills, mechanics and themes that will fill that gap? Even if they can add a new class, perhaps a discussion for another time, how do they continue to develop on the existing ones? That would be Elite Specialisations. Each profession in the game is currently broken into 5 different specialisations, which you train as you level but can only pick 3 of at endgame. These define your build and general capabilities, so an elementalist, for example, can specialise in fire, water or earth magic, air or arcane. A necromancer can choose from death, blood, curses, spite or soul reaping, but again, will only pick 3. The whole system I feel is quite logically thought out and is a refinement and development on the original trait idea the game launched with 4 years ago. With Heart of Thorns, each class was given an entirely new specialisation, a 6th one, to choose from, known as an Elite Specialisation. Every expansion from here on out is likely to expand on this, and that's the system.
The specialization system will allow each profession to master a new specialization that grows that profession into something new. Almost a secondary profession, if you will.
The Elite Specialisations are meant to be much more character defining. They're stronger, offer new utility skills like a new elite, and a weapon. Engineers got hammer, rangers and thieves got staves, and so on. The idea of giving new weapons is one of the very first positive things I can think the system did. Guild Wars 2 has always struggled in the shadow of its predecessor in terms of skill options and variety. Instead of letting players pick from hundreds and hundreds of skills and combine them in any way they like, as in GW1, the sequel binds skills to specific weapons and specific weapons to specific classes in an effort to make each one be as simple to balance and distinct as possible. Leaving the merits or drawbacks of this decision aside, the truth is that many people have been turned away from Guild Wars 2 by this, feeling that there just isn't enough choice. Elite Specialisations, offering entirely new weapons to classes and therefore many more skills, have and will continue to do a lot to alleviate that problem over time. With Heart of Thorns, ArenaNet never invented any totally new weapons though. They simply opened up the existing pool a little more. The Guardian got a longbow, for example, which already existed in the game. Everyone got something that already existed in the game. My guess is this was done because they didn't want to release a new weapon that wouldn't have as many skins available as existing ones, nor were they interested in the process of creating those skins, nor implementing new loot that drops at all rarities, updating vendors, and so on. This was a little disappointing to me, as I've long been looking forward to great axes, whips, spears, and whatever else come in. 1 year on from release, we still have no indication whether that kind of thing is actually on the table for the future. That said, I do have a further observation on this topic that often goes neglected. In truth, the weapon itself really doesn't matter for mechanics. Guild Wars 2 is a game where a Revenant will use a hammer as a super long-range siege weapon, while necromancers and rangers are using axes as medium-range damage instead of actually meleeing people with them. The elementalist already has a skill that functions like a whip, despite it not being a formal weapon in the game. And because ArenaNet have this freedom to make whatever kind of skill or animation they like and twist your expectations, it means they can get pretty much anything they want done with the existing 19 in the game. Hell, and this might be sad for us to think about, but even if we imagine a world where there have been so many elite specs released that every class now has every weapon, they could start to double up. The Necromancer might have a great sword on Reaper with one set of skills and also have a great sword on their Banshee specialization with a different set. All of this isn't to say I'm now happy we haven't had new weapons. A lot of this is about theme. Some of us just want to look and feel like we're wielding a real spear, not a hammer that's merely imitating one. Heart of Thorns still loses points. I just think it's important to understand why we're in this position. I think the best thing we can hope for in the near future are the underwater exclusive weapons, the trident, spear and harpoon gun, to be wieldable by characters above ground, as those are already hooked deeply into the game and have lots of skins. Elite Specialisations aren't just elite because they added a new weapon though. I feel like each one was designed to really feel like a new class, or demi-class at worst.
Almost a secondary profession, if you will.
The most prominent example of this would be how your profession name and icon change when Elite Specialized. A ranger becomes a druid, a thief, a daredevil. You can only pick a single Elite Specialization at a time, so after a few expansions we might picture a nice tree of available options and demi-classes there forward. Imagine a Mesmer, will they become a Chronomancer, an Illusionist, a Mirage, or a Bard? I think this was a fantastic idea, as it was always just a question of implementation whether it would work. Pre-launch, I was a little skeptical that just slapping a new name and icon on an existing class would be enough. You can technically be a Reaper, yet not run the weapon or any skills after all. What if it didn't feel like a big enough change? So far, after a year, I think what we've had is serviceable, and I'm a big fan of the system in general, but it's not all sunshine and roses. ArenaNet just didn't go far enough with integrating these Elite Specializations into the environment and story for them to feel truly real. I do wish they'd gone further. One particularly controversial Elite Specialization was the Guardian's Dragon Hunter. Taken at face value, the name can sound somewhat childish, stupid, or blunt, and this put many Guardian main players off the idea of running it at all. That's a bad thing when your expansion sale might hinge on people liking their new spec. The developers did release a statement that, in fact, the Dragon Hunter should be seen as something akin to a Witch Hunter, and was more an organization of righteous big game slayers, but none of this was qualified by the actual expansion, and that's my problem. It hurts it from feeling like a real class. Another spec to look at is the Chronomancer. This, on the other hand, was accepted very comfortably by the community for its exciting theme that was both fitting to the original Mesmer as well as its new mechanics. After a year of Heart of Thorns, I would rate the Chronomancer as one of the most solid mechanically and thematically of all the Elite Specializations, despite some maybe wonky balance here and there. However, even here, I feel ArenaNet have been a disappointment. See, much of the reason for people being initially accepting of the Chronomancer was its existing place as a part of the franchise. It was a class pegged for the cancelled and unreleased Guild Wars 1 Utopia campaign. Utopia, like the Chronomancer, was looking to have significant time travel themes, from concept art to cryptic clues left in its predecessor Nightfall. But if you really think about it, had Utopia never been cancelled, we undoubtedly would have been introduced to a new class that had significant presence, place, and meaning within its environment. The Chronomancer would have felt at home. Elite Specializations, the Guild Wars 2 Chronomancer, didn't accomplish any of this. The Chronomancer's great, but why it and its time travel theme exists in Heart of Thorns, which has no mention of such ideas even vaguely, is upsettingly untouched. Every single one of the Elite Specializations suffers from this. Like Masteries, they exist only on the UI, and outside of the incredibly vague suggestions, like the Guardian Bram picking up his mother's longbow, there's nothing more to it. Specializations like the Dragon Hunter, and how it's more akin to being a Witch Hunter, would be so much better accepted if the developers took the time to add NPCs, locations, items, and story steps that actually referred to this order and what they do. Guild Wars 2 has often perhaps struggled with making the player feel like they're exploring a world with many layers of history and culture, well established and deep. Elite Specializations were a perfect opportunity to introduce at least 9 different factions, ideals, ways of life, or agendas, and different groups to represent them. But all of this was untouched. Who are the Heralds or the Tempest? What does being a Reaper mean? Why are Scrappers here and not at the Black Citadel? Not only is all of this potentially great story material that goes unanswered, but it also holds Elite Specializations back from feeling like no more than just a name change on the user interface. Another relevant area of discussion here is that of style and gear. If the aim is to make an Elite Specialization feel almost like a new class altogether, it needs a distinct look. Again, Heart of Thorns never delivered for me. Their solution was to tie a collection to the training of an Elite Specialization that unlocks a couple of pieces of gear. It's a nice start, but far too minimal. 2 weapons and a single bit of armor, somewhere around there, usually a shoulder or headpiece we get. Some of it does look nice, yeah, and the weapon is even a fairly good way of getting an ascended quality item. The collection itself, too, is quite intelligently designed, and to have people interacting with a variety of Heart of Thorns and Corteria locations, but I rarely, if ever, notice people equipping these things without reskinning, and basically every player is Elite Specialized. Their visuals just aren't represented. The result has been that the Elite Specializations have minimal identity. Only the Reaper with its new shroud and maybe the Dragon Hunter with its wings really did anything. I would suggest adding at least one full set of gear for the Elite specs. Having locations and new NPCs added to the game to demonstrate this stuff would help with the identity too, but this problem, as far as players are concerned, may just get worse when things like legendary armor release, so maybe the answer lies in skill effects too. I'm a little unsure. Despite these heavy-hitting complaints at the start, I still stand by what I opened the video with, that this is one of the best systems Heart of Thorns introduced. One of its greatest strengths lies in its simplicity and obvious intent. Guild Wars 2 was a game that, for 3 years before Elite Specializations, had no idea how to expand on its roster of class capabilities. We had random heals dropped into the game that would often have no purpose, arbitrary trait additions, and mishandled revamps. Whereas, we had no concept of what would be added in the future, nor with what speed that would happen. The developers were limply trying to make Living World work and shoehorn small updates in where they could. The specialization system did away with all of that haziness and has put the community in a much better position, one where we know roughly what to expect and can easily speculate or theorycraft about what it could be. ArenaNet had stated multiple times that an expansion was a great opportunity for them to work on large systems that Living World didn't give them the time or scope for. When hearing that comment, I think most people tend to think of things like guild halls, but I see no better example than with Elite Specializations that have added so much and will continue to for so long. At the start of this video, I mentioned that Elite Specializations, like Masteries, were developed as a system to answer the question of endgame progression in Guild Wars 2. This is an interesting thing then, as, for all its strengths, I actually feel like it fell down completely in that ambition. To be sure, their decision to lock new specs off till after level 80 was smart, as it quite transparently signals to players at the end that there's more to earn if you keep playing, and it's badass stuff at that. But despite this, players will find themselves finishing an Elite Specialization very fast, and it's not a long-term mechanic. Elite Specializations really don't offer much progression in Guild Wars 2, and this was one of their chief aims at first. There's actually an interesting chain of events to follow on this one. Before launch, the developers had vaguely mentioned that Elite Specializations would have to be earned, and that they were about progression, but they didn't say much more. Instead, they fixated on what was so cool about the mechanics and visual effects. It's obvious why they did this, to get as many customers as hyped as possible to buy the expansion, but this aspect of earning them was mostly left to the side. The result was that, going into Heart of Thorns, many players expected to have their Elite Specialization right away when exploring the jungle or playing the new World vs. World map, and that just didn't happen. ArenaNet had balanced these things to take time, to be something you gradually work towards. There may have been a lot of merit to this, but the community backlashed. It was a particularly big problem for those who felt they should be able to play World vs. World and never leave, and also for those who wanted to have all 9 professions in the game Elite Specialized right on the heels of release. Getting their Elite spec meant a journey of progression, with many hero challenges along the way being much more difficult than any to exist in the original game, and a substantial amount of exploration required in the jungle to boot. To those people, this was just a grind that didn't respect their time. After just a couple of weeks, these criticisms were responded to, with ArenaNet dramatically increasing the reward from the new hero challenges so that people had to do far fewer of them, and unlocking the Elite spec could be done much quicker. At the time of this change, the developers suggested that there'd been a miscommunication. They expressed that, had they been clearer about what they wanted Elite Specializations to be pre-launch, perhaps people wouldn't have been so upset. But for now, they were happy to make things easier for us with Heart of Thorns. Listening to me recap all of this, you may have already made up your mind on whether ArenaNet's original vision, or the community's outcry, was the right way to go. Maybe you think that the developers are corporate douchebags desperate to squeeze playtime out of their audience. Maybe you think MMO players these days are just whiny kids that never saw the value of properly earning something. But in truth, this whole thing's a pretty nuanced issue with a lot of factors at play. As a non-World vs. World player, as an Elementalist main, as someone who played very little of the expansion alone, but nearly always in small groups, as someone who wanted a lot of objectives and goals from the expansion, and as someone who doesn't have many alts at all, I loved the original balance of progression. I found myself continually looking forward to new challenges and maps, unlocking traits and skills gradually, so I could learn them at a decent pace before at last being able to complete it at some point halfway through the story. I never experienced frustration that it was repetitive because I didn't play many alternate characters. I never experienced the challenges being too hard because I was always with someone else. I wasn't upset that I had to leave World vs. World because I don't really World vs. World. And even if I did, I doubt I'd find the thought of leaving the game type to be particularly horrendous. I like the way it used to be. I enjoyed back when nearly all of the hero challenges had meaning and wouldn't be skipped. I don't think it's good how blindingly fast these things unlock now, and how little time people will spend to properly understand what their new skills and traits do as a result. But I can see how your particular experience will shape you here. Like I mentioned a moment ago, I was unlocking Tempest. This is because as a Tempest, I gained access to a lot of my cool skills like overloading very early in the progression. For some classes, this wasn't so true. Particularly Daredevils only gained access to their new dodges, a fundamental aspect of the specialization, right towards the end. These players were being asked to sit through a lot of playtime before getting their shiny new toy, and that would have been frustrating. What's interesting to me now is how we move forward. The state of the game today is that you'll unlock Elite Specialisations quickly, and you have the option of doing it purely in World vs. World, before then stockpiling massive amounts of leftover hero points that will do nothing for you until maybe the next expansion. At this point, when it comes out, we might use those points to unlock the second generation Elite Specs even faster than with Heart of Thorns, and there's no semblance of progression at all. That ambition of ArenaNets will have failed. Is this what ArenaNet intend to happen, now perhaps seeing that it was always stupid to tie this system to progression? Or do they really believe that this is just a communication issue, altering the design of the next expansion to be closer to their initial vision, sticking to their guns and simply being clear to the community about their intent right off the bat? I really don't know which one they'll go for, and I wonder what you guys think. I guess time will tell. The next thing I'd like to talk about are my impressions about balance of the specializations and where exactly they've seen use. Now, we could spend a long time talking about specifics across all three game modes, which I'll refrain from doing as mostly it will be useless information to you. Pre-release, we can hear all we like about the flashy new skills and ideas, but whether they actually got used in the end or panned out is another question altogether. Generally speaking, the Elite Specialisations are designed to be deliberately stronger than their non-elite counterparts, and the result of this has been that almost universally, of the 9 Elite Specs, they've all been used in abundance. I think ArenaNet were very sensitive to this. People wouldn't feel good buying the expansion and then their main character doesn't even have a good reason to run the new stuff. So they tried hard to make sure that didn't happen and have generally been successful. There's been a lot of circular discussion over the year about that fact, by the way, that they're deliberately stronger. Some people feel this is a mistake as it somehow overshadows the original class that no longer has a place. These arguments I see as nonsense. Every build in Guild Wars 2 that is Elite Specialized is still running 2 core specializations. It still has access to and probably uses other core weapons and runs core class skills. A Scrapper build is every bit an engineer as an Engineer Pure build is. I hardly see the problem. Yes, there has been power creep, but expansion areas, as well as both fractals and raids, the 2 areas of endgame actually being supported by ArenaNet, have all been balanced to try and account for that power creep already. The one place where this discussion on deliberately making Elite Specs stronger does pique my interest is with regard to PvP. Here there have been 2 significant problems. First, the power creep. Particularly with defensive abilities, the sheer strength of Elite Specializations dramatically changed the pacing and face of Conquest, often for the worse. Real discussion on the various metas we've had will have to come later, but suffice it to say that many builds, perhaps involving skill-based or interesting mechanics before Heart of Thorns, were straight up muscled out to never be seen again. While not entirely true, a well-accepted community rule of thumb has been that if your build isn't an elite spec, it's not good enough, and that is sad to me. Secondly, I feel this hurt Guild Wars 2's free-to-play prospects. For much time, I believed that, should Guild Wars 2 go free-to-play, it would inject a lot of life into the PvP scene. This did happen, and free-to-play accounts do indeed have full access to PvP now. However, because free accounts don't have the expansion and therefore Elite Specializations, and Elite Specializations are so necessary to be competitive, this entire idea has been dead in the water. Worse, even if it's resolved in the future, you only get to go free to play once. I fear that ship may have sailed. Overall, I really don't mind the power creep on Elite Specialisations. I think not enough people appreciate that the grass is not greener. The alternate world is that of the antitoxin spray, and looks far more grim. ArenaNet adding new things to the game that are so conservatively balanced that it's worse than a coin toss if they see play, and feel utterly underwhelming. Elite Specialisations would shift from being a flagship feature to a mire of wasted potential. There is only one thing that is important, and it is of utmost importance. That future Elite Specialisations do not power creep on other Elite Specialisations. This would be a problem, because if, say, the second Mesmer Elite Spec is straight up better than the current one, the Chronomancer, at putting out quickness and alacrity, the Heart of Thorns Chronomancer would never be used again, and the game loses out. Since, so far, we only have Heart of Thorns, we cannot tell if this will happen, but it should be easy to avoid so long as each Elite Specialisation is given a clear and distinct niche. If the second Mesmer spec instead is just very good at healing people or utilising some totally new mechanic, it can coexist with the Chronomancer just fine, and everybody wins. At first glance, it would appear ArenaNet appreciated this and prepared accordingly. The Druid is all about healing and support. It's unlikely a future Ranger spec will come along to encroach on that, so we're good. The Herald is all about boon support, and it's unlikely future Revenant specializations will encroach so much on that, so we should be fine. However, and this brings me on to my last point and worry about the Elite Specializations, and that is that in their effort to make these first Elite Specializations have a place in the game, many of them don't have a specific niche. They're just good at too many things, and long term, this is asking for trouble. I can think of no better example of this than the Reaper, who we've used many times in this video as an example before and demonstrates two different distinct things. First, we should understand ArenaNet's ambition with this much loved spec. The Reaper was all about giving spiky, non-attritive, no ramp, flat damage to a class that never had it before. You'd get an enormous greatsword and become like a horror movie villain, slow-moving, chilling, and hard-hitting when you at last got close. None of these things were particularly typical of Necromancer design before, and so it was all fun-looking, uncharted territory the community loved the sound of. Unfortunately, in the year since the release of Heart of Thorns, things haven't worked out for the Power Reaper. Despite being thoroughly fun to play and with some interesting ideas, it just doesn't measure up. The damage is far too low to compete with other options in raids or fractals, and its quality of life is far too low to measure up in PvP and World vs World. Unless you're with tolerant friends or are feeling daring, you're pretty much limited to open world type content and story, or any place where things are just easy. And this was exactly my experience. I played Power Reaper as ArenaNet envisioned it, at the launch of Heart of Thorns, wandering around the jungle. I had some fun, but sadly haven't been able to go back since. So, thing number one that the Reaper demonstrates, it's an example of an elite spec that never really worked out how it was designed to, and it's fairly unique in that respect, as most of the other ones have ended up in the place the developers were looking for. But this story gets more interesting when you realise that, despite this, people still run Reaper. And that's because they run it for condition builds. It just so happens that bundled into Reaper is a single, very overpowered trait that is excellent for condition damage. So excellent, in fact, that necromancers are willing to pick up the entire Reaper line just for this one thing. Even if it's a failure in the rest of its ambition, this one thing props the Reaper up. The result is that, yeah, people have been running it, but it's nothing fundamentally different to what they used to do. It's the exact same style of gameplay necromancers have always had, and it doesn't key into much of what Reaper was supposed to be about. Maybe we can be happy that the developers included this condition damage trait and saved the Reaper, so to speak, but the cost has been great, and it's the second thing the Reaper is a great example of. The purity of purpose for this elite specialization has gone out the window. What's it for? Condition damage, classic necromancer gameplay, heavy hits and greatsword action. This thing is even a potent minion mancer thanks to one of the skills. Things aren't well defined. So what do ArenaNet do with the Generation 2 Necromancer specialization? Make it heavy condition damage, only to replace the Reaper outright? Or worse, find that people keep running Reaper anyway? Do they go with minions and have the same problem? Have another shot at a flat damage spec and the same problem again? The answer on your lips may seem obvious. Just balance the Reaper to be good at power like it was always supposed to. Nerf its Condi potential and add that in somewhere else. But this hasn't happened. And worse, many people in the community now like the idea of Reaper being in that condition damage space, and the waters are muddied. The balance team didn't act quick with much of this stuff, they haven't implemented purity of purpose, and I cannot stress this enough, that this happens to a greater or lesser extent to every elite specialization right now, and the balance changes are still few and far between, with the developers struggling to think more about splitting for PvP, world versus world, and PvE at once, let alone this long-term stuff. If you're really interested in a deep dive into this topic, I'm personally an Elementalist main who sees a lot of this problem in that elite specialization, the Tempest. The Tempest, despite its name, was released as a supportive elite spec, but then deliberately tuned to power creep as a heavy damage thing too. At the end of this video and in the description, I'll link to a nearly 2-hour discussion I've made purely on the Tempest, focused largely on the importance of theme and purity of purpose. I genuinely am worried about the longevity of the elite specialization system and the balancing nightmare headed towards the devs based on how they implemented this first set. It's just not a problem that's manifested yet. The great tragedy of this whole story might be in the Dragon Hunter. I already mentioned some kickback against this specialization earlier over its name and a lack of lore, but this extends to mechanics too. The Dragon Hunter, funnily, is a great example of purity of purpose preserved. It's a long-range damage dealer who utilizes traps to catch their targets unaware, and it's done this well right through the year. But the thing is, unlike the Necromancers who wanted a flat damage build and never got it, or the Warriors who wanted to berserk, or the Mesmers who wanted to time travel, most Guardians didn't want traps. They didn't want to be sneaky or to have more ranged damage, and so despite there being real purity of purpose here, it doesn't buy them much love because it's in the wrong place. And here's the saddest thing about that. Back in 2012, when Guild Wars 2 released, ArenaNet said to us, hey guys, here are 8 classes, and each of them is good at different things. Here is the Guardian. Pick this guy if you want to support your friends. Pick this guy if you want to be on the front lines, controlling the enemies. People picked Guardian in PvE and had held on to their Guardians in PvE for 3 years, hoping that one day this would actually come true. This is where your World of Warcraft tanks went, that they would have this role that they truly and explicitly feel like the tank or the support. And Heart of Thorns? It did exactly that, adding more well-defined roles like real tanking and aggro management, and a necessity for strong healing and mitigation. Except, not for Guardian. Guardians became Dragon Hunters. Guardians do little more than auto-attack and spam protection or fury on their team, while it's been the Chronomancers, the Reapers, or even Scrappers that have typically had the luxury of being the tank. Guardians got traps. How sad is that? I personally have no problem with making elite specializations that are antithetical to the core class. I think that's a fun concept. But perhaps on this one, it really was a mistake to push out the Dragon Hunter first and not something more explicitly supportive or tank-based for the class instead. I had a comment from someone in my stream just last week complaining that Guild Wars 2 has no roles. Now this is a fairly antiquated opinion by any stretch these days, and a debatable one even before the expansion, when Guardians could routinely support with Aegis, Blinds, Reflects, and Quickness in dungeons. So it came no surprise to me then to hear that this person was a Guardian main, who for so long has wanted to do what his class is advertised as being capable of, but never felt he was afforded the opportunity, and especially not in Heart of Thorns, where you'll find the best PvE that they've ever made. And so those are my thoughts on elite specializations. Despite my fairly critical comments here, I do overall love the concept and what it has brought to the game. While perhaps not being a worthwhile system for end-game progression, and while perhaps not going far enough to integrate into the world of Guild Wars 2, Elite Specialisations were a blessing for this franchise, as long as inspiration for both mechanics and themes runs thick, as long as they are careful about making Elite Specialisations that are very divergent from core classes, as long as they give the existing specializations the purity of purpose they deserve, I anticipate Elite Specialisations being one of the strongest selling points in Guild Wars 2 expansions for years to come. It's just, if they don't get these things right, it might be a bit of a ticking time bomb. Thanks very much for watching, guys. Let me know what you thought of this, and until next time, I'll see you for the next installment.